What's up, YouTube? It's your boy JP's on the keys in this 2 video today. And we got a history video for y'all today. You know what I'm saying? This is facts about slavery never mentioned in school. So I kind of have like a mixed review of Thomas Sowell. Like, I feel like, I obviously know that slavery didn't just happen in America. Like, this is what my grade school education taught me, my typical American education taught me about slavery. Back in 12, the first slaves were brought over from Africa all the way to Jamestown, which I feel like still makes no legitimate sense. You're going to go all the way across the ocean to bring people all the way back, knowing that most of these people are not going to survive the journey because they're going to die on the ship. They're going to get sick. They're going to die of disease. But that's what I've been told. And slavery was a government-sponsored institution for about the mid 1800s, when abolitionist groups came up. Then the North wanted to, abolish slavery, but the South was like, you want to get rid of slavery? We're going to break away from the country because we don't want to give up slavery, which I feel like people still try to say the Civil War was about states' rights. It was the states' rights to own slaves. Like, there's no other legitimate reason. We were infringing on our rights. What other rights were they infringing on than the right to own slaves? But then again, Civil War ended. Slaves were considered people, which is freaking ridiculous. But they were considered people now, even though it was still a whole bunch of just discrimination and segregation until about maybe the 1960s, where after all this stuff happened, after schools finally got integrated, probably 10 years before this, and civil rights, now is all these marginalized groups are now fighting for rights, black people, women, LGBTQ, young people, and we're here today. But this is the facts, the slavery that they never taught us in school, because, I wonder who decides the curriculum. Who really decides the curriculum? Who really decides what to teach the young kids? Think about it. No parents. It's no parents in this curriculum. These are men in suits, But let's get to it. But the black rednecks and white liberals. Untold facts about slavery.
The instrumental use of the history of slavery today also underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. For most of its long history, which includes most of the history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves.
Right. I mean, I still don't really understand, like, how would you do that? So you're telling me you're going to go in a boat from the U.S., bro? I gotta do. Hold on. You're going to travel almost 8,000 miles to get people, then travel another 8,000 miles to bring them back, and they're supposedly just supposed to stay alive the whole trip, chained up in a ship on the water with disease-ridden, mice-infested ships and no land, and you don't have any decent latrines for like, there's no way. I don't. That still questions me. Like, how did you come back? How do you come all the way? Like, that doesn't make economic sense to me, but, And I feel like most slavery was like, these dudes were POWs. They were prisoners of war. Like, we beat you in war, now we're going to enslave your people. That's what it originally was.
And transport them en masse across an ocean. People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked.
Right.
The peoples of the Balkans were enslaved by fellow Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East, for at least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Before the modern era, By and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans. Asians enslaved other Asians. Africans enslaved other Africans.
Exactly. This is true. This is very true. Can we bring us to another statement? This is just a little simple tangent. They never mention this when they talk in America about it's always black on black crime, but it's never white on white crime, never Mexican on Mexican crime, never Asian on Asian crime. You know what I'm saying? You see how they play with your mind? I've always wondered that. Why do they play? Why does the media play into racism so much? The media plays into it. If we're going to be honest, because it's always one side or the other. You can never be in the middle. It's always you're either here or you're here. If you're even somewhere in the middle, something's wrong with you because you need to be here or here. Think about that, bro. Man, it's a lot of narrative pushing out here, man. Like, be careful of what you consume. I'm being honest, because I was a victim of that. I'm not going to lie to you.
And the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere.
Right.
Slavery was not based on race, much less on theories about race. Only relatively late in history did enslavement across racial lines occur on such a scale as to promote an ideology of racism that outlasted the institution of slavery itself. Wherever a separate people were enslaved, they were disdained or despised, whether they were different by country, religion, caste, race, or tribe. In East Africa, the Maasai were feared slave raiders, and other African tribes, either alone or in conjunction with Arabs, enslaved their more vulnerable neighbors. As late as 1891, it was reported that Manyuema slavers had demoralized surrounding tribes, destroying crops, and famine reigned everywhere. Even in the early 20th century, Abyssinians were still raiding other Africans and carrying off slaves. It was 1922 before the British had gained sufficient control in Tanganyika to stamp out slavery there.
And this is why I will always respect the British, because the British were actively fighting to end it. You know what I'm saying? They were actively fighting to end slavery, even though we can talk about colonialization another day. But these people were actually fighting to end it actively. You know? Like, the British were like one of the first countries to end slavery, if we're being honest. You know? It didn't have to be a war to decide whether we wanted to keep slaves or not. You know what I'm saying?
Arabs were the leading slave raiders in East Africa, ranging over an area larger than all of Europe. The total number of slaves exported from East Africa during the 19th century has been estimated to be at least 2 million. The form in which the story of slavery has reached most people today has been along the lines of the best-selling book and widely watched television miniseries Roots by Alex Haley. Challenged on the historical accuracy of Roots, Haley said, "I tried to give my people a myth to live by. This instrumental use of history..."
Hold a myth? A damn myth. Bro, my grandparents have that movie. Do you know how many times I watched that movie? Kunta Kinte, Toby. A myth? A myth. Are you... Okay, all right, okay. I see what type of time it is. It's like I said before, it's a lot of narrative pushing out here, man. It's a lot of narrative pushing. But, like a myth?
Or purported history is open to the same objections as other instrumental myth-making. Despite the impression created by Roots, during the era of the massive slave trade from West Africa, a white man was more likely to catch malaria in Africa than to catch slaves himself. The average life expectancy of a white man in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa at that time was less than 1 year. By and large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coasts of Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible. Even so, the death rates among the white crews of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves. It was only much later, after quinine and other medical measures enabled Europeans to survive where there were tropical diseases, was it possible for them to invade Africa in force and establish empires there. But by then, the Atlantic slave trade had already been ended. During the era of that trade, Africa was largely ruled by Africans, who established the conditions under which slave sales took place. The crew of a slave ship was in no position to defy African rulers and their armies by going out across the land and capturing people willy-nilly. The stronger African people...
Like, I always thought that. Like, there's no way you can go into an African tribe and just be like, hey, we're taking you. Like, it had to be some type of deal. That's what I've always thought to myself. So you telling me that some random white guys came over to your country, some people you have probably never seen before in your life, and just be like, oh, we're going to take all these black people. We're going to take them all. Like, there had to be some type of deal worked out. I had a feeling. It was always like a conniption in the back of my head. Like, there always had to be some type of deal. Like, some type of business transaction. Like, I always thought that. Because it's like, there's no way you just willingly let these random people come and take your people without no type of, and you don't do anything about it. Like, both sides are complicit.
Captured and enslaved the weaker peoples. The same pattern found over the centuries in Europe, Asia, the Western Hemisphere, and Polynesia. In Nyasaland, the Ngoni and Yao swaggered over and terrorized other tribes. In Uganda, the Baganda made life miserable for their neighbors. And the Nyoro and Hima of Anko enslaved Toro women and children. The Tutsi dominated the Hutu in Rwanda.
Right.
The Maasai lorded it over the Kikuyu and Kamba. And the latter, in turn, held the Indorobo in a kind of serfdom. It was precisely the fact that Europeans, except for the Portuguese, seldom participated in the raids that captured and enslaved Africans that enabled most people in Europe and the Americas to remain oblivious to the traumatic experience that this was, with some Africans committing suicide to avoid capture and wives being whipped as they tried to cling to their husbands or children. Historian David Breon Davis pointed out that Europeans had little contact with the actual process of enslavement, and that, as late as 1721, the Royal African Company asked its agents to investigate the modes of enslavement in the interior. Europeans typically saw only the end results, enslaved people being offered for sale on the coast. It was much the same story in the Ottoman Empire, where those who bought slaves had no idea what these slaves had been through before. The unique position of the Western world in the history, and especially the destruction of slavery, need not imply that there was unanimity within the West on this institution. In addition to whites who defended the enslavement of Africans on racial grounds, or who opposed general emancipation on social grounds, there were many whites, and even blacks, who defended slavery as a matter of self-interest as slave owners. Although most black owners of slaves in the United States were only nominal owners of members of their own families, there were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts.
Bro, I'm going to tell you what it is. I'm going to tell you exactly why, bro. Because you remember how in the slave plantations it was always the one slave that was trying to keep the other slaves in line. He really thought he was cool with the master. I'm trying to tell you, man, it was a business deal. It was for money. It was for money. You enslaved your own people for financial gain because you knew that slavery was the number one institution in the South. That's the only reason they defended slavery, was for financial gain. Because they knew how much money they could make from slavery, from free labor. Oh my God, I can make all these crops. I don't have to pay my workers. Oh wow, that's so much more money in my pocket. You feel me? Like, it has to be a few within. It has to be. You know what I mean?
an estimated 1/3 of the free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War.
For financial
Black
gain.
slave owners were even more common in the Caribbean.
They're protecting their investment. This is an investment for them. Why do you think the South fought so damn hard during the Civil War? To protect their investment. White or black. Obviously, slaves were in the investment. Slaves were the number one currency in the South. Because this is free labor. We're exploiting labor to boost money from agriculture that comes into our pockets. Like, come on, dog. Like, it's like telling me that it wasn't black people snitching on other black people to get them enslaved again. Like there wasn't black people part of the trying to get fugitive slaves and report them back to their slave owners. You feel me? Like, I always had a feeling that it was I always had a feeling that it was the opposite of what I've been taught. I had a feeling because there's no and I'm thinking to myself, so every free person just magically went to the north? But if you're in Louisiana, how far was the closest free state? Think about it. If you're in Louisiana, you probably had to travel, like you're in the deep, deep south. You had to travel hundreds and hundreds of miles to get to the nearest free state. Free state. Most of these people were not going to walk that far. So if probably as long as you had your free papers, hey, I got me some money, I'm going to buy me some slaves. Right. Financial gain, because they realized how much of a commodity they were back then. They realized it. These black people knew.
In short, there were many defenders of slavery in the West,
of course,
even in the 19th century.
Of course.
And outside the West, slavery was too widely accepted to require defense.
Still going on today.
No other nation ended slavery in the same way as the United States did,
right.
And few ended it after so short a struggle, as history is measured. How and why did slavery end in most of the world? There were two major processes. Over the centuries, as more and more territories around the world consolidated into nation-states with their own armies and navies, raiding those territories to capture and enslave the people who lived within them became more hazardous in itself, and also risked military retaliation against the countries from which the raiders came.
Right.
Thus, more and more peoples became off-limits to slave raiders over time. Put differently, the areas which remained subject to slave raiding over the centuries were primarily those where the people lived in smaller or weaker societies. Such societies continued to exist where it was difficult, for geographic or other reasons, to consolidate large areas under one government. This was true of the Balkans, the backwaters of Asia, and much of sub-Saharan Africa. By the early modern era, sub-Saharan Africa, with its numerous and severe geographic handicaps, was one of the last remaining areas from which vast numbers of people could be enslaved.
Wow. That was great. But listen, I like watching this because, you know what I'm saying, I want to learn something. But when certain people are trying to turn it into a gotcha moment, see, look, black people own slaves too. See, look. Like, that's why I feel like it's a disconnect. Because I'm trying to learn. You're using it to try to prove a point to me of why I shouldn't feel a certain way based on what happened to people that look like me. We don't do that. Because every time, I feel like it's always a certain group of people, not everybody, but it's always a certain few that try to use these type of videos as like a gotcha moment and like try to prove me wrong. See, look. Like, we're learning here. You know what I'm saying? This is a learning moment. You know what I'm saying? I'm not coming here to try to bash anybody. I'm just trying to learn what's going on. But let me know what other videos you want me to watch of Thomas Sowell. Thank you again for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed. Hit that subscribe button if you're new to the channel. Check out my post notifications. I'm out. Please be safe. Stay on the grind. Peace.